for. So we'll go ahead and start the recording. And I can officially welcome Grant High School from Oregon to our Unit 1 hearing this afternoon. Students, congratulations on making the top 12 for the We the People National Competition. It's awesome that you all got this far. It's a big deal. We're delighted to see you and looking forward to hearing your presentation. My name is Emily Voss. I am the We the People coordinator for Virginia. And in just a moment, I'll hand things to the judges. They'll introduce themselves. They'll invite you to do the same. And then they'll go through the process that you know as well as anything else. They'll read you the question, you'll respond with your prepared statement, and we'll go into some Q&A with 2 bonus minutes. All right, so with that, judges, please take it away.
Hello, Grant High School. My name is Miriam Memar Sadeghi. I judge this every year. I participated as a student the very first year We the People was offered on the bicentennial of the US Constitution, long time ago. And I serve on the board of the Center for Civic Education. Currently, I have spent a large part of my career providing civic education opportunities to people living in not free countries, including Iran, where I am originally from.
Sue Leeson, Oregon Senior Judge.
Jim Moore, Center for the Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin. It's nice to be here.
Could you
You guys are?
Hello, we're Unit 1 from Grant High School in Portland, Oregon. I'm Cohen Hegelke.
I'm Jared Smith.
I'm MJ Sassy.
I'm Maddie Snyder.
I'm Evan Hawkert, and this is our teacher, Ms. Dee Pasquale.
Hello, teacher. I'm going to read the question. We're going to get started. We are Unit 1, Philosophical and Historical Foundations of the American Political System. We start with a quote from Benjamin Rush. "The American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. To what extent, if any, did revolutionary principles influence constitution making during the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? To what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles evident in modern times?" Please begin.
In 1815, John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson, "What do we mean by the revolution? The war? That was not part of the revolution. The revolution was in the minds of the people." During the founding period, from 1763 to 1800, the revolution consisted of principles such as popular sovereignty, consent of the governed, natural rights, the rule of law, and political equality. These principles were well understood previously in Britain, ancient Greece, and the Roman Republic, but were made revolutionary by American colonists writing them into higher law through constitutions.
Early state constitutions reflected these principles and embodied fear of centralized power. 7 state constitutions had prefatory declarations of rights, and all but 1 instituted bicameral legislatures. They also emphasized the power of the people by, as Gordon Wood wrote, creating equal electoral districts, requiring annual elections, and granting constituents the right to instruct their representatives. However, because most states limited suffrage and office holding to white male landowners, power only rested in a subset of the people, an issue we still face today. The national constitution, while still influenced by revolutionary principles, took a more balanced approach to instituting government.
The Constitution checked tyranny with frequent elections, restrictions on dual office holding, checks and balances, and separation of powers. While more reserved than state constitutions, the national constitution also emphasized popular sovereignty, evident in the House of Representatives election process, the Guarantee Clause, Article 5, the 10th Amendment, and the state ratifying conventions under Article 7. While theories of political obligation vary, the Declaration of Independence states that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Thus, consent is necessary for constitutions to be legitimate. However, problems arise in determining whether consent must be unanimous, as was required by the Articles of Confederation, or if a majority of consent suffices, as it does under the federal constitution.
After ratification, governments rely on tacit consent to derive legitimacy, an idea discussed by John Locke, who asserted that people consent to be governed by benefiting from a government. However, Locke also argued that people have a right to revolt, withdrawing their consent. Outside of revolution, though, the only way to revoke consent is to expatriate, which is rarely realistic. One of the framers' solutions was including an amendment process as a bloodless revolution. The amendment process under Article 5 requires a supermajority of states for ratification. The Constitution has only been amended 17 times since the addition of the Bill of Rights, demonstrating how difficult it is to acquire the consent necessary for ratification. However, since legitimacy stems from consent to a government, not specific amendments, consent is a less vital consideration during the amendment process.
Revolutionary principles remain central to American political thought, evident in modern-day equal rights movements such as Fair Fight and Black Lives Matter. The principle of natural rights is also prevalent today, seen in gun control and abortion debates, as well as the anti-vax and anti-mask movements. Although John Adams wrote, "The revolution was in the minds of the people 206 years ago," his words hold true today. Revolutionary principles, while often controversial and difficult to achieve, are as important today as they were in the founding period. Thank you. We are ready for your questions.
Well, let's start out with one of the first fights about revolutionary principles. The Anti-Federalists claimed that they were true to the American Revolution and the Federalists were not. So what's up with that?
Yeah, one of the major debates in terms of revolutionary principles were over natural and individual rights. Many Federalists claim that the addition of a national Bill of Rights was unnecessary, and so were not in support of state constitutions having declaratory declarations of rights at all. For example, as Pauline Maier writes in her book Ratification, at the Virginia State Ratifying Convention, George Nicholas said that the 5 or 6 states that did not have declarations of rights were just as equal as Virginia in terms of how many rights were offered. And he described a Bill of Rights as merely a paper check that did not actually ensure that individual rights would be protected.
Many anti-federalists also spoke out against the change between requiring anonymity in the consent process, because the actual Constitution only required 9 out of 13 states. But the Federalists responded by saying that it was all right because the Constitution would only be in effect in the states that decided to ratify it. However, the anti-federalists felt that having that small of a minority of states not ratifying it would essentially force them to ratify it nonetheless.
The Federalists were trying to find a balance of these revolutionary principles that, while overemphasized in the state constitutions, led to legislative supremacy. A big contributor to this, according to Gordon S. Wood in his book, The Creation of the American Republic, was the stripping of the executive's power of appointment, which he said made the executive in the state constitutions little more than chairman of executive boards. The federal constitution went in a different direction, and under Article 2, Section 2, grants the president, with the advice and consent of Senate, appointment powers.
Thank you. Thank you.
How do you reconcile the theory that the revolution occurred in fact many years before it occurred in theory with Rush's claim that the revolution is not yet complete and we need not only the principles, but the American public citizens to become imbued with new morals and new manners? Two very different views of the situation. What's your view?
Well, I think we see this idea that people do agree that our very individual liberties are eroding and Washington, D.C. is broken, as Texas State Representative Kyle Biederman, when he was filing the Texas Independence Referendum Act, which is a movement to achieve Texas secession. So we do see that some people are believing that these individual liberties are not fulfilled.
And I was asking a more historical question, whether you agree with Rush that we're going to have to change American thinking and culture and manners a whole lot against the Balin theory that the revolution had already occurred in fact before it occurred in theory.
I would say that I agree with Rush's claim that, and that we see that these revolutionary principles have not remained static through American history. And in a sense, the revolution has never truly ended, as we have seen popular sovereignty expanded through things such as the 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments. And there is currently very much contemporary debate over voting rights, popular sovereignty, and these key revolutionary principles that still lead the country to develop and take new views on how exactly these revolutionary principles should be applied in our expanded and more diverse country.
I agree with Rush, and I think his position is better explained in a 1777 letter he wrote where he wished the war could last longer because he believed liberty without virtue would be no blessing to us. He recognized the moral demand on the public that republicanism has, and realized that the revolution would be nothing if it didn't exist in the minds of the people.
I think we
that
can
moral
also see
demand- that moral demand. How healthy and pressing do you see it today on the American populace? Do you feel it? How alive is the revolution now?
I believe that the revolution is very much alive today. For example, we recently saw many voting rights restriction bills that restricted voting rights around the country, such as in Georgia, which established voter ID laws and shortened the absentee or the hours that polling offices were open. And thus we see that there is still great moral debate and great political questions in terms of who exactly we should give rights to. And it is important to continue striving to make sure that these principles are followed.
We
And
can
I
also
think-
see how this tradition of revolution is alive today with all of the protests that happened in our hometown Portland this summer and have continued to. And we can see that this kind of civil disobedience in a way is a revolution for the rights of equality to all types of people in our country. So I think we can see that revolutionary spirit manifesting itself in that.
MJ, you were going to say something too? You want to continue?
I was going to say something along the same lines, and I think that we can see this moral demand is very much alive today because people aren't taking the tacit consent that they're giving. They're not accepting that. And so they're using their First Amendment rights, and they're even using some of their rights in the legal process to actually contest that. And they're actively taking on this moral demand to speak out against things that they don't agree with and feel that their liberties are being eroded.
Yeah, we even see.
Do you think we have enough civic pride? Maybe it seems like you think we have enough protest. Do you think we have enough civic pride and unity?
I don't think that we have enough civic pride and unity right now. And I think that a lot of that comes from the polarization that we're seeing in our country today. A recent Pew Research Center study found that the amount of people who express consistently liberal or consistently conservative views has doubled over the past 2 decades. So we're seeing an unprecedented amount of polarization. And that same study found that people's tolerance for people that have different views for them has also drastically dropped. And so we're seeing polarization with a lack of tolerance for other people that erodes that unity.
So is that gonna make people feel like there's less consent in this society?
I think it does show that people think there's less consent in society. For example, during the Capitol insurrection on July 6th, a major reason why people felt that they were entitled to the right to revolution as outlined in the Declaration is that their consent was undermined due to this issue of election fraud that they believed was really threatening our democracy, and that the candidate that was elected was not fairly actually elected.
And we know that consent is being revoked because civil disobedience, according to Henry David David Thoreau in Civil Disobedience, that civil disobedience, while it's peaceful, it notifies the government that you are revoking your consent without actually expatriating, which is a very limited possibility.
So did the folks who did the January 6th thing, have they undermined their principles by using courts? I mean, if they were revolutionary, why bother with courts? Just keep raising hell.
I think that they did undermine their principles by using courts. And I also think that they undermined the validity of their right to revolt by going through that judicial process, because it was found in over 60 lawsuits that the allegation that there was election fraud was failed to be proven. And so they didn't actually have a basis for their revolt on the Capitol.
I would have ventured to agree with the revolt had there not been any due process for their claims. But I agree with MJ in that they found in over 60 lawsuits that there was no validity to their claims of election fraud. So I think given that they had plenty of due process, their revolutionary claim was invalid.
I don't believe that using the courts undermined their revolution or their principles. It's important to exhaust all legal remedies before revolting. This was seen in the American Revolution. They used the olive branch petition ahead of time before declaring independence.
And going to the Declaration.
Time.
May I
So
finish?
it's a good time to end. I think since you just were starting and we called time, it's probably great.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Pleasure to listen to you guys. The idea of the minds of the people prevailed throughout your presentation and your answer to the questions. And I do think that it's so obviously important. I mean, the way that this country was founded, that sets it apart from the rest of the world, is that ideas matter, and that ideas are the foundation, new ideas about humanity, about what makes for good government, and that human nature needs to be understood and guarded against in order to have freedom. These are all ideas that carry through to today, and I think there was a consistency in your approach. I really appreciated that. You were also very natural. You were well-read, clearly well-prepared. Congratulations to you and your teachers and your parents.
Yeah, I appreciated your opening statement. Was very well organized and very easy to follow. And I appreciated you wrestling with this, how much consent is consent enough? What's the Goldilocks moment? 100% in the articles for amendment, too cold. Was the Constitution's requirement? What's the goal? What's the just right? So I appreciate the fact that you're wrestling with those options, and that essentially is the great American question. How do we get to that consent perfection? I especially liked in the follow-ups your understanding of the anti-federalist critique of the Federalists as betraying the revolution. Certainly their demand for rights, but also your structural arguments that and the ratification percentage itself was un-American, according to the anti-federalists, that it was rushed, and this idea of the presidency enters into their arguments that the Federalists had designed a monster or a many-headed hydra, I think one anti-federalist said. So I especially like your explanation on that follow-up. And I'll leave my colleagues to comment on their questions, but I appreciated the use of history in your follow-ups. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think looking at the early state constitutions, because they did set the foundation for what was considered at the Constitutional Convention. These folks just didn't come in out of thin air and come up with this stuff. I was puzzled by the idea, as I think I understood it, that where the state constitutions went off the rails from the perspective of the drafters of the national constitution was with respect to legislative supremacy. And yet Madison makes a pretty powerful argument that of the three branches, the legislative branch will always dominate, as it must in a system based on popular sovereign consent of the government and govern in political equality. Madison, I suspect, would look in today and say, boy, was I wrong. We had one efficient Congress, and I'm not sure where my beloved Congress has gone since then. I would love to have heard you address that problem and how what seems to be the inefficiency or almost ineptness of the legislative branch has affected these so-called revolutionary principles. But that's a somewhat trivial critique. Nice presentation. Thanks for your hard work and really good interaction with us in the follow-ups.